Okay, good afternoon. We're going to begin. I'm David Theo Goldberg, both in Anthropology and Director of the UC Humanities Research Institute, and it's a pleasure to chair this session, the third of three sessions with Abdoumaliq Simone. I'm sure some of you have been meeting with him and hanging out with him, and it's been a pleasure to have him here. Today's session is on an inventive methodology. As with everything else, the methodological is transforming dramatically, both in relation to its logics and relation to its sightings. Malik has long been at the forefront of experimenting as much with methodology as with most everything else he turns his attention to. I'm not going to spend much time, if any, rehearsing the long vitae of the three panelists. Abdoumaliq Simone is currently at the Max Planck Institute, where he's a researcher this year. He's held positions around the world at Goldsmiths and at the University of South Australia and various other places. He's done extensive work for at least probably 30 years in major cities throughout Africa, bringing our attention to little-known considerations in terms of civil society in the continent, in the Middle East, and increasingly now in his more recent work in Southeast Asia, and in particular regarding Jakarta, and continues to sort of push the boundaries of thinking the urban. The two conversationalists, we intend this as a conversation amongst all of us, so we want to sort of open this up fairly quickly. Kris Peterson and George Marcus are both here, as you know, in the Anthropology department. Kris's recent book, Speculative Markets, is on drug making and drug faking in the case of Nigeria, and she too has been sort of experimenting, you could say, in these regards with the experimental. And George Marcus, of course, likewise needs little, if any, introduction. Has long experimented around questions of the methodological, on parasiting the ethnographic in every sense of the term, and I think I'll just leave it at that and turn it over and welcome once again to our great friend Abdoumaliq Simone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for your generosity and the last couple of days here. I really appreciate the time and the attention that people have given me. I'm very appreciative of it. I'm not really the best one to talk about this kind of stuff, really, because I've largely been a mercenary for most of my life. I've rarely ever initiated or carried out a straightforward research project ever. It's more always something that I'm asked to come into situations that look pretty bad and try to make them not any worse than they already are. I must say that I'm not always successful in making them not worse than they already are, but I've been very fortunate in my life to basically come into situations that are somehow facing particular kinds of dilemmas and being given the opportunity to try to reframe those dilemmas into something that are perhaps more of an opportunity than they are. That said, I do want to just spend a moment talking about the notion of inventive method, because there are a group of colleagues that I have been working with over the past couple of years mostly sociologists, mostly affiliated at one time to goldsmiths, not necessarily any longer, who have tried to think about notions of inventive method. And perhaps in some ways, particularly for anthropologists that are maybe a little old hat and not something very, very, very new, but are surrounding the notion of interfacing. And as Alexander Galloway, I think elegantly puts it, that the interface is a kind of agitation or a generative friction between different kinds of formats. And some paintings by Helena Maida on this notion of a kind of the frictions or the generative frictions of the disjunction on the surface between edges, between different kinds of formats. And so we were, in terms of thinking about what it is that sociology does and what the empirical is for sociology, we increasingly thought about the kinds of potentials, not of trying to get underneath the surface of things, but how does one indeed work at the surface of things? For the surface of things is, as a pulsating interface, is continuously shifting the relations between the asymmetries of inside and outside. It's always a kind of trickster of orientation that both shapes figure and ground, and at the same time confounds any clear sense of what is here or there, then or now. So the difference between figure and ground can be maintained, but the relations are continuously deformed and remade. And as such, the surface twists and turns, shape-shifting its way in and out of realities, which it secretly impels, unaware of its own capacities and contradictions. It need not be what it is. There is always something else it could be, in order to do what in the end it does anyway. And so for us, this is in some ways the notion of the new empirical. That is, it need not be what it is. There is always something else it could be in order to do what in the end it does anyway. So invented, to quote my colleague Celia Lurie, who really is much more the driver of this than I ever hoped to be, is, I think, importantly when she says inventiveness is, if there is any, is to be found in the way in which interface as method or interfacing can be used to establish not so much the fixed or given conditions of possibility of the object or the problem identified by the method, but to generate its own boundary conditions, and in doing so operate as an experimental system. What is at issue is the kinds of knowledge that methods produce. In this case, this is knowledge of what did or could have or could happen, of what might be within a dynamic methodological system or apparatus. So this is the knowledge of what can be as well as what is. So it's always dealing with this kind of doubleness. Always what can be as well as what is. Always a way of recomposing the problematic. This is not a use of method to establish or confirm knowledge of what the world is, but knowledge of how the world can be enacted to be tested in trials, experiments, or even in play. And so, in some sense, when you talk about the interface also in a temporal sense, that the interval is not only a matter of delay. On the one hand, when we perceive something, we tend to be conscious of the quantity, degree, magnitude, breaking things down into parts, or considering the thing to be part of something, a category, in order to have an overview in relations of what something is next to, what it's similar to, what it's contained by, adhered with. But we also sense things as something in their own right, a lure with its own inexplicable force, which provokes an affiliation that does not exert control, is not a projection or a judgment. So this is an interval, an edge, where everything is not given all at once, Rather, it is an indeterminate and inventive moment, the condition of being otherwise than what something is at any particular kind of moment. And so, in some sense, so for example, while the intensities exerted by things and bodies may generate attractions and repulsions, drawing things near or far, there are no predetermined reasons why things or events should necessarily connect, be in a relationship with each other. There's usually, in terms of sort of sociological research, it was always, this is the problem, this is the method, and this is the answer in a way. And so there's, in some sense, to look at the empirical in a way in which, yes, there are connections, but there's no predetermined reason why things should necessarily be in any kind of relationship with each other. That is, whatever relationships do happen, okay, we can retrospectively reveal the properties that explain how things are attuned to each other, how they complement or engender new capacities. But these characteristics of the relationship can't fully account for how the relation was operationalized. This then is the role of a certain kind of empiricism, a certain kind of technicity, to individuate as ensembles of things, to make them hold or endure across different times and situations, while at the same time being completely contingent and capable of endless variation. So, for example, from what we know about logistics, I mean, there's a lot of writing about logistics these days. And that we know in logistics that there's a kind of process of disembedding particular nodes, transit, and processing sites from the specificities of their relationship with particular locales and demographic compositions and social and economic histories and cultural practices. And that in order for logistics to work, in order for this particular site to be in some sense connected across this seemingly seamless transmission belt, that it requires an open-ended sense of how these sites now acting as nodes could be articulated in new and various ways. It entails how they are multiply situated in a plurality of different circulations. This is a process that reiterates the fundamental instability of interconnectivity. So in some ways, is it possible as a kind of inventive method to utilize this kind of instability of interconnectivity? Can we learn something even from neoliberal logistic practices about the tentativeness of interconnectivity that in some ways works for us in a different kind of way? That kind of instability of the connection. So in some ways, a lot of times we tend to know what this is. We tend to immediately see it and say, all right, we know what is happening here. We can predict what the outcome of this is going to be, that this surface means something, that this surface means a kind of warehousing of a kind of urban population, cheap quarters, not meant to last, affordable for the moment, a sign that means a kind of substantial disentangling of particular kinds of ways of inhabitation that have been honed and built over long periods of time. We know what this surface is. We read it and we sum it up and we know it. But what I'm also interested in some ways is that to what extent is the surface the trickster here as well, the trickster of orientation? And in some ways, what else could this indicate? What else could this be? What else could this kind of, obviously it is the culmination of a process of disembedding, a kind of instability of the connectivities that have been built within urban environments over long periods of time. But what else could it be? It's going to do its job. It's going to do its job. It's going to warehouse, and it is. It houses 30,000 people who all have this sort of aspiration to be the new middle class. We know what it does. It's going to end up doing what it ends up doing anyway, but is there something else? And what are those kinds of interfaces? What are those kinds of connections to other things as a kind of strange attractor? What are the edges? The edges are to particular places of ruin or of ambiguity, of particular kinds of drawings, particular kinds of imaginations, particular kinds of anonymities, particular kinds of ways in which very different kinds of populations can be housed in close proximity to each other. It becomes a kind of place of experimentation that was unforeseen by the planners. I mean, it was the first time, this building, when we wanted to look at it, it was the first time in my life that I ever had, I've never gone before a research council in a country ever before. And it was a sort of pro forma matter that we needed in order to get visas for a couple of postdocs that were coming from Pakistan and from China to look at this place. And it turned out to be a kind of nightmare because no one wanted us to look at this thing. I mean, no one wanted us to look at this surface, and this surface seems to have wrapped everything up. There seems to be no secret here. There's nothing to be, but yet it was almost impossible to get permission to look at it, because in some ways they knew that the interfaces had a certain kind of plenitude and multiplicity to them. They knew that in some ways of course, the current vice president of Indonesia had a kind of investment in the building of it. That's part of the reason. But also they knew that they had to do something to provide affordable housing, but they also knew that they couldn't anticipate what was likely to happen to it. They thought they could wrap up everything in this. They thought they knew what this meant. They thought that in some ways it was a kind of homogenizing kind of thing. But in some ways, the difficulty in getting approval to really look at it was, I think, deep down they knew that they were producing a sort of new kind of collective subject, a new kind of series of problems, a new kind of series of things that were not easily handled or managed. And so in some ways, the inventiveness of the process is to be able to look at surfaces like this and see something else to them, see within them some kind of possibility that doesn't seem to be enwrapped within the surface itself. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about sort of in the realm of both ethnography at the level of graduate training, and sort of hear from you about some of your experiences in terms of, pulling a project together like this in its, multiple sort of conceptualizations, right? So, approaching the megacity, as you describe it, I think is a particularly interesting place to first go, because in my own experience in trying to understand Lagos, it took years to really understand what was going on. You step into a place like Lagos and immediately it's hyperstimulation, it's sort of overwhelm, and nothing makes sense. I think the first time I went, I came back to, I stopped in New York for a few days, and it felt like a sleepy, boring, slowed down village, right? And compared to like what I experienced, but over time, as an ethnographer, you get to understand the layers and the singularities, the various kinds of connections, the city and its multiplicities, the way in which, as you've described, people as infrastructure really being able to stitch, multiple aspects of the city together. And so I'm wondering if you could, talk about how you, when you first kind of come into a place like Jakarta, for example, what do you do to kind of apprehend all of those moving parts and sort of, and where is that moment of inventiveness? Like, when does that sort of crystallize as an aha moment, like, you know, as you're trying to figure things out? And I would love to hear about how that works in your collaborations. So that would be the first question. The second question has to do with sort of after those initial encounters and that sort of a sustained attention that you have to bring to them, which pertains to the way that you write about your research. If for those of you who've been reading some of the articles that we've circulated and the sort of larger corpus of work, you'll notice that there's not like a lot of heavy-duty citation. I mean, the citation kind of works through nods in a conversation that's happening sort of within the literature and stuff. But the beauty of your work is the ways in which all of the theory making is coming straight out of the data itself. And so I would love to kind of hear about that process. And I think for graduate students, this is something that we talk about a lot here, you know, because folks have initial troubles actually trusting that there is something to be said about the data that they've collected. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk about both of those processes, just the sort of how-to, you know, kind of approaches. He's tired. He's a little jet lagged.
I mean, like I said, I ain't such a good model for this kind of stuff. I mean, you
do it.
You have to make you have to make certain kind of decision. I mean, I started to work in Jakarta without any intention about working in Jakarta. Mm-hmm. I had been there once, you know, years ago, and I was invited by something called the Urban Poor Consortium, which is a kind of social movement although they wouldn't really see themselves as a kind of social movement, but it was a kind of organization which tried to work with the poorest of the poor in Jakarta through organizing particular kinds of activities and groups across the districts within the city in about 70 different areas. And they wanted me to talk to them about work I had done in African cities. Mm-hmm. And then they wanted me to come work with them. But but how? You know, I didn't speak the language. I didn't know the city. I said, well, I'm not really all that well prepared to do it. They said, we'll give you 80 people to work with. Oh my God. And we want you to train these 80 people how to do research. And it was like, well, what do you want me to train them to do research on? I said, we need them to know how to do research on their communities. And I said, well, you obviously look at all the limitations that I have. And they said, it really doesn't matter. Let's give it a try. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically how it started, with the one stipulation, which was that I would work with them as long as they didn't do research on their own communities. They had to do research on areas that were contiguous to where they lived, but where they weren't living, mm-hmm. And that they had to be paid. So we had to go and try to raise money to pay them, and which we did. And then that became a kind of job for them for almost two years. So it's the process of having to try to learn as much of the language on the run, of having to work with other people who had absolutely no basis in terms of doing research, who felt like they were basically ill-equipped to do it, but felt like that this was a kind of chance for them to do something that they never had done before. And in some ways, you had to build a kind of institutional basis for this. So it meant that I couldn't be the only one who's working with them. So I had to go make alliances with universities, and I had to go make alliances with other people within Jakarta that would support it. And we would have to make alliances with local authorities, which would allow people to go snooping around and asking questions. And so basically it's a process of doing ethnography and networking, but largely on the fly, or largely by everyone doing something that no one was used to doing together, and to always pay really a lot of close attention to what is it that we can do together, and always asking that question, and never taking for granted what the answer might be. But what was really interesting is that you had high school students, you had kids that were 16 and 17 and 18 years old, producing kind of stuff which I've had doctoral students not be able to produce with that kind of. So there was a certain sense of what are kinds of different sort of practices of investigation, what are different kinds of incentives of investigation, what are particular kinds of pathways in and out, how much. You have to always make ethical decisions about what is acceptable and how, but acceptable to who, and under what circumstances. Can you say to an 18-year-old kid, I'm going to break into this factory, and I'm going to rifle through the corporate documents, and I'm going to do it because I know how to do it, and I want to do it, and regardless of what you tell me to do, I'm going to do it. So then, how do you relate to this kind of determination? How do you always reevaluate what it is that the working relationship between you is? So that's why I'm saying I'm not really oftentimes the best equipped to talk about really a kind of systematic way in which this kind of work gets done. But I think what's important in all of this is that particularly in urban research, there are always seemingly surprising opportunities to draw lines between actors and locations and points of view and institutions which seem to be impossible to draw lines between. And if you don't start out with a preconceived notion of exactly how you want people to be partners, if you don't start with a preconceived notion about how you're going to divide up labor and work, but rather where you in some sense see that there are possible complementarities amongst very different agendas and very different kinds of interests, and that lines can be drawn and they can be complementary in some way with each other, then that becomes a kind of project in a way. And it's a project even if it doesn't produce anything publishable or useful or in terms of a new policy or a new framework. The lines have been concretized and substantialized in some kinds of ways. So for me, what's more important is opening up particular kinds of working relationships amongst people that otherwise wouldn't be able to, wouldn't work together. and sometimes one's own stupidity, and sometimes one's own inadequacies become the kind of fulcrum point for those kinds of lines to be drawn. So sometimes it's important to act stupid and to not know what one's doing, because it allows other people to feel like, oh, together we know then what it is that we're doing in some way.
I wanted to ask a question related to this. That's the issue of methods of this sort, or how this work is positioned in. I just wanted to ask, have you seen the film The Act of Killing?
I have.
2012 in Medan, Sumatra, and I'm just wondering, the contextualization for this is one response to the kind of unsettling of kind of ethnographic methods in the 80s was really, I think it was healthy up to a point to go deeper into the embedding of ethnography in local history and making it more complex than ever. You know, it also coincided with the high point of the development of postcolonial theory, so it was very rich. But what I've seen happen in recent times is that ethnography has lost its kind of historical rootings in that regard and is far more oriented toward futures, emerging futures, et cetera. And I think that's also very, very interesting. But I'm wondering, in that kind of shift, which I see as clear, so you have something like The Act of Killing, which is an amazing piece of production, but also field work and investigation that I think took place. Actually, today, as I was just thinking about your work, I was also listening to a podcast that talked about that. It actually was conducted, took about 6 or 8 years to do, by Joshua Oppenheimer, and by Indonesians who still must remain anonymous. And I thought the cityscape, or the urbanscape, and the way that was expressed in that film was quite amazing. So I take it Medan has been subject, not maybe to the degree of Jakarta, to these kinds of changes and projects and futuristic imaginaries with the problems that you kind of point out. But also in a key scene of that film, a terrifying scene, is where the killer takes, who's now his friend, takes the filmmaker back to something that is now a handbag shop, but it's still the same building, where they tortured people and then executed them above stairs. So what I guess I'm saying is that despite the changes on the landscape and the kind of orientation toward a future, there's a kind of deeply and traumatic kind of history that's also in these places that what amazes me about The Act of Killing is just the ability to elicit it in a way. Anyhow, I'm just...
No, I mean, I think it's very. I mean, in another project that we did, where you know, in Jakarta, only recently has there been a kind of democratically elected governor, and so there's sort of a democracy at the highest level and then at the very lowest level. And then they introduced something called sort of these village councillors in each kelurahan, each sort of district. And they were elected without anything to do. So basically we're asked to sort of, well, what can they do? So their job was to become sort of researchers for the kelurahan. This became their job. So one thing that what we tried to work on was, in a sense of asking a lot of people, how did this place get to be the way it is? You know, why is it the way it is now? And how did it get to be this way? And of course, all these kinds of stories and memories are highly contested and contradictory, and all over the place. But what was interesting is the kind of conversations then that people had in terms of trying to come up with points of view that were enabled them, all these different various diverse ideas, to be accommodated in some way, rather than to be simply assumed. The assumption is that we're all here together, and that's some kind of an accomplishment. So when we're asked, well, how is it that that's possible? Well, you have all kinds of different viewpoints about it, and all kinds of arguments and contestations. But what was very interesting about the process was the way in which there was this kind of concerted attempt to try to specify a rubric which allowed all those things in some sense to coexist. And so, yes, the past can be haunting, the past can be traumatic, the past can be, but also in the investigation of the past, is there a way in which that all of those different pasts can be at some point maximally present in that particular kind of moment?
The discourse you've generated, I have some wonderful quotes from articles that Kris had me read that were particularly about methods, but it's really about having people that you work with, planners, people who actually have to produce results, build things under schedules, maybe in an international framework, having to take account of the imaginary and how ungraspable it is. So, I mean, I just read a quote here. Research is then, but it's consistent with much else you said, research is then not a matter of identifying locations, but explicitly inventing them in a context where residents endeavor to act as if the undecidability of their location in a larger world either does not exist or does not matter. And this is a very sweet kind of conclusion for anthropologists, because we like the imaginary as a kind of objective study and result. But how, I'm asking pragmatically, that now that I see that you've done a lot of work as advising projects and so forth, how does that work with the kind of either foreign or local technocrats that you have to work with, who will nonetheless build what you showed? I mean, maybe you're not on those projects, but on, with planners in general. So ideologically, the imaginary is fine, and they're aware that things are complex on the ground. But this is a very radical doctrine for people who have to finally build things.
No, but I mean, in this particular project that I showed. It's what is the kind of point of view, and in some sense, they built it anyway. It's not going to last. If it lasts 10 years, it'll be all right. It's like 30 square feet 30 square meters for families of 5 and 6. The places are constantly flipped. It's not going to last. But what's interesting is it becomes a kind of strange attractor in a way. And you want to, and one thing's interesting is what goes on around it. So that in some ways, this place has 30,000 people inside, okay? 30,000 people. The surrounding area before the project may have had 25,000. Now it has 50,000. It's doubled in size. It's doubled in size not because they're living inside, but because around the edges, this has meant a whole different story, which the planners and the technicians never really anticipated. So the volume of available rooms and housings have doubled. You have all kinds of young people moving in because they see, moving around the periphery of it, looking, hunting for different kinds of opportunities, making different kinds of alliances inside and outside. And in some ways, if I'm willing to work with planners and developers and technicians to build this kind of thing in certain situations, on the bet, on the hunch that around it, something else is going to happen, which could be very much interesting and something to work with.
Yeah.
Whereas others might say, okay, no, this is a kind of epitome of a neoliberal kind of condensation. It's ruined all these neighborhoods. It's broken up and disentangled all this stuff. And yeah, you might want to try to sort of hold on to it and say, I want to preserve this. And in some instances, you want to do it. I mean, in a way, in some ways, the much of the urban core of Jakarta has already accomplished the ideal of what we want from a sustainable, high-density, green city. And why they're taking it apart, God only knows. But somehow, to not work with these kinds of projects sometimes misses the possibility of what else, in some sense, can be contiguous to it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.